Imagine paying for a seat in first class only to be told you don't belong there. Imagine being asked to move, not because of safety, not because of policy, but because someone else's comfort was valued above your dignity. That's exactly what happened to Ethan Cole, a respected CEO on his way to Houston for one of the biggest business deals of his life. At 30,000 feet, in the quiet hum of an airplane cabin, a simple flight turned into a battlefield of justice, power, and respect. Why was he asked to give up his rightful seat? Why did the airline side with privilege over fairness? And what would Ethan choose, stay silent to protect his future, or speak up and risk everything he had built? This isn't just a story about one man on a plane. It's about the choices we all face when dignity is challenged. Do we bend or do we stand? Stay with us, because what unfolded shook not only that flight, but an entire industry. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Ethan Cole never liked airports. Not really. They were always loud, restless places, full of rushing footsteps and impatient announcements echoing off walls of glass and steel. But on this particular morning at JFK International Airport, he carried himself with the calm steadiness of a man who had endured far worse storms. At 45 years old, dressed in a tailored navy suit and polished shoes, Ethan looked every bit the successful CEO the business magazines described him to be. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay memories no sharp suit could ever erase. In his leather briefcase, tucked between contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sat a worn photograph of his mother, Grace Cole. She had raised him and his two sisters alone in Detroit, scrubbing floors and working double shifts in diners where the smell of grease clung to her hair long after midnight. Grace used to tell him, with tired eyes but unshakable conviction, "Dignity is non-negotiable. Ethan, don't you ever forget that." Those words had been his compass. They guided him through college, through the brutal early years of entrepreneurship, through boardrooms where he was often the only black man at the table. Now, as founder and CEO of Meditech Solutions, a medical technology company poised to revolutionize patient care, Ethan was preparing for what could be the most important deal of his career, a $600 million partnership with Skylink Airlines. The irony didn't escape him. He was flying with the very airline he intended to strike the deal with. In a few hours, he would be sitting across from executives in Houston, presenting the final terms of a partnership that could reshape Meditech's future. That thought should have filled him with excitement, but instead, there was a quiet heaviness in his chest. He had traveled too many miles to forget how quickly dignity could be stripped away in places like these. The first reminder came at the security checkpoint. Ethan placed his watch, shoes, and laptop into the gray plastic bins, moving with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The TSA officer glanced at his boarding pass, then at his face, then back to the pass again. "Random check," the officer muttered, pulling him aside. Ethan gave a small nod, as if to say he was used to it. The pat-down was quick, the scan thorough, and he was finally waved through. He slipped his jacket back on, his jaw tight, but his face calm. He knew better than to protest. He also knew it wasn't really random. By the time he reached the Skylink first-class lounge, the tension in his shoulders had eased slightly. The lounge was quiet, almost serene low lighting, leather chairs, the faint aroma of roasted coffee beans. But even here, the silence carried undertones. He caught the quick double-take from the receptionist, the lingering glance from an older man sipping bourbon in the corner. Ethan smiled politely and chose a seat by the window. He opened his laptop, though his eyes soon drifted back to the photograph of Grace, slipped into the inner pocket of his briefcase. Her voice echoed in his mind. Dignity is non-negotiable. Ethan leaned back and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about Detroit in the 70s, about the night his mother walked him home after a grocery store clerk accused him of stealing candy he never touched. He remembered the hum of the streetlights, the way Grace squeezed his hand and whispered, "Don't you bow your head, baby. You hear me? They can take a lot from us, but not that." That moment, that fierce insistence on holding one's head high, had shaped him more than any business school lecture ever could. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the present. It was a message from Jordan Hayes, his COO and closest confidant. Houston team set. Investors ready. Skylink execs expecting you at 4 p.m. Ethan typed back a simple confirmation. On my way. See you soon. He closed his laptop, exhaled, and checked the time. Boarding would begin in 20 minutes. He collected his things, rose from his seat, and walked toward the gate. As he moved through the terminal, he noticed the small details most people overlook: the child tugging at her mother's sleeve near the newsstand, the janitor carefully aligning trash bins along the wall, the subtle announcement that echoed over the loudspeaker. Ethan carried a presence that made strangers look twice. Some recognized him from magazines. Most simply registered him as someone important. Yet Ethan himself carried no arrogance, only the calm assurance of a man who had built his success one difficult step at a time. When he reached gate C21, the attendants were already calling first-class passengers. He presented his ticket, exchanged polite greetings, and stepped onto the jet bridge. The cool, recycled air of the aircraft met him, familiar and oddly comforting. As he entered the first-class cabin, his eyes fell on seat 2A window, spacious, quiet. He placed his briefcase overhead, sat down, and let the leather cushions cradle his back. For the first time that morning, he felt at ease. The cabin around him hummed with low conversation. A man in 1C was already typing furiously on a laptop. A woman across the aisle arranged her handbag and coat with meticulous care. Ethan slipped a small photo of his mother into the seat pocket in front of him. A quiet ritual he performed every time he traveled for something significant. It grounded him, reminded him who he was, where he came from, and what mattered most. As the minutes ticked by, the rest of the passengers began to file in. Ethan barely noticed. He was reviewing his notes, rehearsing in his mind the key phrases that could sway Skylink's board later that afternoon. The numbers were solid, the strategy clear. All he needed was composure, and composure was something he had mastered long ago. What he did not know, what he could not possibly foresee, was that this calm moment in seat 2A would soon be shattered. Before the aircraft left the ground, before Houston ever appeared on the horizon, Ethan Cole's dignity would be tested in a way that no contract, no deal, no polished suit could protect him from, and this test would not only reshape his future, but also send shockwaves through an entire industry. But for now, he sat quietly, unaware of the storm approaching, unaware that the very airline he planned to partner with would force him to remember his mother's words in the most painful way imaginable. Dignity, after all, was never negotiable. Ethan Cole believed he had long since grown used to the quiet weights that pressed down on him in public spaces, the subtle shifts in tone, the faint edge of suspicion. Yet as he walked back through the bustling corridor toward his departure gate after leaving the lounge, he could still feel the old currents moving around him. Airports were like mirrors of society. They revealed who was hurried, who was privileged, and who was always asked to prove they belonged. The lounge had offered brief comfort, but out here the world pressed closer. Families herded children toward fast food counters. Business travelers barked into phones. Screens flashed departure times. Ethan moved through it all with a steady stride, but he caught the looks, those small, fleeting glances that lasted half a second too long. A woman adjusted her purse strap when he passed by. A man in a blazer tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Ethan returned their looks with a calm, practiced smile. Inside, he felt the familiar tug of irritation. He reminded himself not to let it stick. Not today. He had bigger things ahead. When he reached a coffee stand, he ordered a black Americano and stood waiting. The barista, a young man barely out of high school, called him sir twice in the span of a single sentence, his tone a touch too formal. Ethan wondered if it was nervousness or assumption. He took the coffee, nodded his thanks, and moved on. These were small details, but they gathered like drops of rain on a window, clouding the view little by little. He sipped the bitter heat, letting it anchor him in the present moment. At gate C-21 the crowd had thickened. A cluster of passengers lined up at the counter, pressing for upgrades, asking about seats. Ethan approached the side reserved for first class and presented his boarding pass to the attendant. She looked at him, then at the pass, then back again. Her smile was polite, but her pause was noticeable. Ethan had seen that pause countless times in his life, the one that asked silently, "Are you sure this belongs to you?" He did not flinch. "Thank you," he said evenly when she returned his pass, and he stepped aside. The seating area was crowded, yet Ethan chose a corner chair by the window, away from the bustle. He set his briefcase on his lap, checked his phone, and found another message from Jordan Hayes. Reminder: Skylink's CFO is very sensitive on margins. Emphasize cost savings from our tech. Ethan typed back quickly. Got it. We'll handle. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, but the brief exchange pulled his thoughts inward. He remembered the first time he had presented to a boardroom full of skeptical investors. He had been 32, dressed in a suit he could barely afford, standing before a table of older white men who spoke to him as if he were an intern. The memory came back with sharp clarity. He had told himself that if he could survive that humiliation, if he could hold his ground, then he could survive anything. Yet the sting lingered even years later. Dignity, his mother had said, was not something you compromised, but life had forced him, again and again, to measure how much dignity he could protect without burning down the opportunities he needed. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, staring out the window where planes taxied across gray runways. This trip was supposed to be about victory. Meditech Solutions had climbed higher than he had ever imagined possible. His company was not just profitable, it was respected. Their devices were saving lives in hospitals across the country. The partnership with Skylink would mark a new chapter: medical equipment on aircraft, first aid systems integrated into every flight. It was practical, innovative, and profitable. A deal that would cement Meditech's legacy. So why, Ethan asked himself, did he feel the faint unease of storm clouds gathering? Was it simple fatigue, or was it the way the Skylink staff had glanced at him? The pause in their voices, he told himself, it was nothing, that he had faced worse. And yet, deep down, he knew. Bias had a way of creeping into places it didn't belong. He had seen it in classrooms, in offices, in restaurants, in the very boardrooms where he now commanded respect. Why would an airplane cabin be any different? He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the low murmur of voices wash over him. He thought again of Grace. His mother's laugh, soft but resilient, came to him as if she were seated right beside him. She had always carried herself with dignity, even when she had no money, even when the world dismissed her. Ethan had promised himself, long ago, that he would carry that same dignity into every room, no matter how cold the reception. A boarding announcement broke through his thoughts. First-class passengers for Flight 16P7 to Houston may now begin boarding. Ethan stood, adjusted his jacket, and picked up his briefcase. The crowd shifted. Families jostled to gather belongings. Economy passengers craned their necks, and the first-class line began to form. Ethan joined it, walking with calm certainty. As he reached the gate attendant, she smiled more brightly this time. Perhaps it was recognition, perhaps just routine. "Enjoy your flight." "Mr. Cole," she said, handing back his pass. Ethan gave a small nod. "Thank you." He stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft growing louder with each step. Inside the plane, the air carried that recycled coolness unique to every cabin. The seats of first class stretched ahead, wide and inviting. Ethan located 2A quickly. He placed his briefcase overhead, slipped into the seat, and exhaled. For a moment, peace returned. He sipped the last of his coffee, set the empty cup aside, and leaned back into the leather. Around him, other passengers were settling in, attendants moving gracefully between aisles. Ethan pulled the photo of Grace from his pocket and slid it into the seat pocket before him. It was his ritual, a reminder of where he had come from. He looked at her smile, faintly faded with time, and felt steadier. He was ready for Houston, ready for the deal, ready for the future. What he could not know was that this flight would not be remembered for business or contracts. It would become something else entirely, a turning point, a collision of dignity and entitlement, a moment that would demand from him more than numbers or negotiation ever could. The silence he carried within him, the practiced patience, would soon be tested against the weight of another man's privilege and an airline's complicity. For now, though, the plane door remained open. The cabin buzzed with light conversation, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of luggage. Ethan sat quietly in seat 2A, calm on the outside, storm already building within. The hum of the aircraft grew steadier as more passengers boarded, each dragging carry-ons, adjusting coats, claiming space in overhead bins. Ethan Cole sat quietly in seat 2A, the cool leather against his back, his briefcase safely stored above him. He had always liked the window. It gave him a private world, a square of sky framed just for him, a reminder that perspective was larger than any cabin walls could hold. He loosened his tie, only slightly, just enough to breathe comfortably. He had learned long ago to balance professionalism with ease. Appearances mattered. Too relaxed. People mistook you for careless. Too rigid. They assumed insecurity. Ethan carried himself with that practiced balance, aware of every glance but never giving away how much he noticed. The first-class cabin filled slowly. A man in 1C settled into a seat, already typing furiously on a laptop as if the flight itself were an obstacle to his work. Across the aisle, a woman arranged her scarf and handbag with meticulous precision, her perfume drifting faintly toward Ethan. He acknowledged them with a nod but no words. He preferred silence before takeoff. The attendants moved gracefully, checking seatbelts, offering water or champagne. One paused by Ethan's seat, her name tag reading Linda. Her smile was polite but brief, professional without warmth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole," she said. "Can I get you anything before we depart?" "Just water." "Thank you." Ethan replied. His voice carried calm, even kindness, though he noticed the way her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long, as if verifying he truly belonged in this seat. He had grown used to it, the small hesitations, the silent questions behind people's eyes. He reminded himself not to let it burrow into him. As Linda moved on, Ethan leaned back, his mind already shifting toward Houston. The numbers, the projections, the negotiation points. He repeated them in his head like quiet prayers. $600 million was not just money. It was expansion, innovation, security for thousands of employees who depended on Meditech. The responsibility sat heavy but steady on his shoulders. He slipped his hand into his inner pocket and touched the worn photograph of Grace. It steadied him. She had endured more in her life than any boardroom could throw at him. He thought of her laugh, the way she could find humor in the smallest cracks of light, even when bills piled high and the refrigerator was empty. She had given him strength that did not waver. A boarding announcement echoed through the cabin, reminding passengers to stow their belongings. More travelers shuffled past, their faces flushed with travel weariness. Ethan barely looked up until a group of 3 men entered, their voices louder than most. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying an air of entitlement that clung to him like cologne, paused at the front of the cabin. He scanned the seats as if surveying land he owned. Ethan did not know it yet, but this was William Harrington, a real estate mogul accustomed to having his way. His eyes landed on seat 2A, and his expression shifted irritation, disbelief, then something colder. Ethan felt the gaze before he even looked up, but at that moment, Ethan kept his focus inward. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the rhythmic shuffle of boarding around him. He imagined the engines roaring, the ground falling away, the steady climb into blue sky. He loved that moment, the lift, the sense of leaving behind what was heavy. He had always believed flights were metaphors for life itself. Turbulence, calm skies, sudden storms. You held on, you trusted the process, and eventually you landed somewhere new. The cabin quieted as the final passengers filed in. Ethan adjusted his seatbelt, folded his hands, and exhaled. He allowed himself a small smile. There was peace here, in this brief pause before takeoff. He thought of Jordan Hayes waiting in Houston, of the investors eager to finalize numbers, of the pride in his team's eyes when the deal was announced. His mind wandered back to Detroit for a moment, to the cracked sidewalks of his childhood neighborhood. He remembered walking past houses with peeling paint, the laughter of kids chasing a battered basketball down the street, the smell of fried chicken wafting from windows. He remembered the stings of being told people, like you don't belong here, when he tried to enter a corner store. And he remembered Grace, her hand firm on his shoulder, teaching him that dignity was the one currency no one could steal. That dignity, he knew, had carried him all the way to this seat. Seat 2A was not just a ticket. It was a symbol, a quiet victory over every barrier he had climbed. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the engine seep into him. Yet beneath that calm lay the faint tremor of unease. He could not explain it fully, but he sensed something in the air, the way the attendants whispered near the galley, the way glances lingered just a bit too long. He had felt it in the lounge, at the gate, in the hesitant smiles. It was as though the world was preparing a test he did not ask for. Still, he reminded himself, peace was a choice. He chose calm. He chose composure. He chose not to let suspicion dictate the tone of his day. The captain's voice came over the intercom. steady and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skylink Flight 1627 to Houston. We'll be departing shortly. Please stow your belongings and prepare for takeoff." Ethan looked once more at the photo of Grace in the seat pocket, her faded smile like a beacon. He whispered under his breath, so softly no one could hear, "I'm ready. Mom, outside the window." The sky stretched wide and open, pale blue against the horizon. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt light, untouchable, as if nothing in the world could unsettle him. He did not yet know that within minutes, that peace would fracture, that his presence in seat 2A would ignite a conflict far larger than the confines of this cabin, that his dignity would be tested in front of silent witnesses who would later replay the scene on glowing screens across the country. But for now, the engines hummed, the cabin lights dimmed, and Ethan Cole allowed himself to believe that the journey ahead was his alone to control. Ethan Cole sat still in seat 2A, hands folded neatly, gaze set on the window. The hum of the engines and the faint clink of glasses in the galley formed a calming rhythm. He wanted silence, wanted to keep his focus sharp for Houston. Yet, there was a shift in the air, a subtle change, like the cabin itself had grown smaller. He felt the presence before he looked up. A shadow lingered near his aisle, a figure standing just close enough to be impossible to ignore. Slowly, Ethan turned his head. William Harrington loomed there, his frame blocking part of the aisle light. He was dressed in a crisp gray suit, his tie knotted tight, his shoes polished to a sheen. His hair was perfectly combed back, and he carried himself with the air of someone who rarely heard the word no. His eyes narrowed on Ethan, then flicked to the seat number above. "That's my seat," Harrington said, his voice low but carrying enough authority to turn heads nearby. Ethan blinked once, calm, unshaken. "Your seat?" His tone was measured, even polite, as though asking for clarification. "Yes," Harrington snapped, tapping the armrest of 2A. "I always sit here. Always. This is my seat." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his boarding pass with deliberate precision. He held it out. 2A. Issued to me. That makes it my seat today." His voice was calm, but his eyes didn't waver. Harrington did not take the pass. He leaned closer, his breath tinged with cologne and impatience. "You don't understand. I have flown Skylink for 20 years. The crew knows me. This seat is mine." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A woman in 2C glanced away, pretending to busy herself with her phone. The man in 1C stopped typing, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. Silence thickened. Ethan inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. Inside, though, a familiar ache pressed at him the knowledge that this wasn't about a seat. It was about something larger, something older than either of them. "Sir," Ethan said evenly, "I don't doubt your history with the airline, but today, 2A belongs to me. That's what my ticket says." Before Harrington could retort, a figure approached. Linda Matthews, the lead flight attendant, her smile tight, her eyes darting between the two men. "Mr. Harrington, welcome aboard," she said with an almost rehearsed warmth. Then she turned to Ethan, her expression softening into a different kind of smile, one that carried subtle tension. "Mr. Cole, there seems to be a misunderstanding." Ethan's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "No misunderstanding. My boarding pass is right here. 2A. Linda glanced at the pass but barely looked before turning back to Harrington. "Mr. Harrington, perhaps we can find a solution." Harrington folded his arms. "The solution is simple. He moves. This is my seat." Ethan felt the weight of eyes on him, silent witnesses waiting to see if he would yield. He thought of Grace's voice, echoing in his memory. Dignity is non-negotiable. He breathed in, breathed out. His heartbeat was steady, but his thoughts flickered if he stood his ground. He risked escalation. If he yielded, he gave away something more precious than comfort. Linda spoke again, her voice honeyed but edged. "Mr. Cole, perhaps you wouldn't mind moving just one row back. There's an open seat in 3C. Very comfortable." Ethan looked at her. The quiet steel in his eyes startled her. "Are you asking me to give up the seat I was assigned?" Her smile faltered. "I'm asking for cooperation, just to make everyone comfortable." Ethan's thoughts spun. Cooperation. How many times had that word been used to cover injustice? He remembered being 12, asked to leave a store because cooperating would avoid trouble. He remembered being 21, pulled aside by police for cooperation during a mistaken stop. Now, at 45, sitting in a first-class seat he had rightfully purchased, the same word pressed against him again. Harrington smirked. "It's not a big deal. Just move. You'll still be in first class. Don't make this difficult." The air thickened. Ethan looked out the window briefly, as though seeking his mother's face in the reflection. He whispered inside himself, "What would you do, Grace?" He already knew the answer. Turning back, he said firmly, "No, I will not move. This is my seat. My ticket says 2A, and I intend to remain here." A hush fell over the cabin. Linda's smile hardened. Harrington's face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. The man in 1C stared openly now. The woman in 2C glanced nervously at her call button, but did not press it. Linda's voice dropped lower, meant only for Ethan. "Mr. Cole, please, don't make this into something bigger than it needs to be." Ethan's response was quiet, almost a whisper, but unyielding. "It already is." Harrington straightened, looking past Ethan to Linda. "I don't see why we're even debating this. You know me. You know where I sit." Linda hesitated, torn between policy and preference, between fairness and familiarity. Then she said, almost too quickly, "Mr. Harrington, let me speak with the captain. Please, have a seat for now." Harrington scowled, but finally dropped into the seat across the aisle, his glare never leaving Ethan. Ethan felt the burn of that stare, but refused to shift under it. He sat still, his hands folded, his gaze steady on the horizon outside. The engines hummed louder, as if echoing the rising tension. Ethan's mind was calm on the surface, but beneath it, conflict surged. He thought of the deal in Houston, the investors, the headlines if something escalated. Yet deeper still was the echo of Grace's dignity is non-negotiable. As Linda walked toward the cockpit, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers whispered, shifting uncomfortably. Ethan caught fragments. Why not just move? He paid for that seat. Always trouble when it should be simple. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in strength. He would not yield. Not here, not today. Minutes passed like hours until Linda returned, her expression carefully arranged, her voice steady but carrying the weight of decision. "Mr. Cole, Mr. Harrington," she began. "The captain has been informed. We're considering options." Options. The word hung heavy, colder than the recycled air around them. Ethan knew then that this was no longer about comfort. It was about principle, about whether dignity could survive in the face of entitlement. He straightened in his seat, shoulders squared, his mother's voice still echoing through the years. He whispered once more, so softly only he could hear, I'm ready, Mom. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here, in seat 2A. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as preparations for departure continued, yet in the front rows of first class, the air felt charged, brittle, like glass about to crack. Ethan Cole sat firmly in seat 2A, his posture calm but unyielding. Across the aisle, William Harrington leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at Ethan as though sheer force of will could push him out of the seat. Linda Matthews, the lead flight attendant, reappeared with another figure in tow, Captain Robert Mills. His crisp uniform seemed to sharpen the atmosphere, his pilot wings gleaming in the overhead light. His presence alone made several passengers straighten in their seats. Authority had entered the cabin, and authority demanded obedience. "Gentlemen," Captain Mills said, his voice even but edged with command, "we've had a seating issue brought to my attention. I want this resolved quickly so we can depart." Ethan lifted his boarding pass again, holding it steady in his hand. "Captain, there is no issue. My ticket says 2A. I am sitting in 2A. That should be the end of it." The captain took the pass, glanced at it briefly, and then returned it with a nod. "It does say 2A?" "That's true." His eyes shifted toward Harrington, whose scowl deepened. "But Mr. Harrington is a valued frequent flyer with this airline. He has occupied this seat on many occasions. Out of respect for that history, we're asking for your cooperation in moving to 3C. Ethan's chest tightened. There it was again, that word, cooperation. He looked into the captain's eyes, searching for any sign of fairness. All he saw was convenience, the preference for smooth departure over justice. "With respect, Captain," Ethan said slowly, each word deliberate. "History does not overwrite policy. A paid ticket is not a suggestion. It is a contract. Today, that contract places me here." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers glanced down at their laps, others at the ceiling, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Yet a few couldn't hide their curiosity, their eyes darting between the two men like spectators at a match. Harrington scoffed loudly. "This is absurd. You're really going to let him hold up the entire flight over one seat? I've sat here for years. Everyone knows that. This man is just making a scene." Ethan felt the words like barbs, sharp and dismissive. A scene. That was how it was always framed, not injustice, not bias, but the fault of the one refusing to bow quietly. He steadied his breath. His dignity was not negotiable. "Captain," Ethan said, his voice low but firm, "if the airline has made a mistake in its loyalty program, that is not my burden to carry. I purchased this seat. I will remain in this seat." Captain Mills' jaw tightened. He wasn't used to resistance, especially from passengers. His gaze flicked to Linda, who avoided his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm asking you to be reasonable. We can't delay departure over this. Reasonable." Another word Ethan had heard too often, twisted to mean surrender. He thought of Grace, of the long nights she spent defending his worth in a world eager to diminish it. She had always told him that when you gave up small battles, you taught the world how to treat you in larger ones. He heard her voice now, clear as ever. He answered softly, but without compromise. "I am being reasonable. I am asking for nothing more than what I have paid for." The silence that followed was thick. Harrington shifted impatiently, shaking his head, muttering under his breath. Passengers leaned back, uncomfortable but riveted. The tension was no longer just about one seat. It was about the invisible weight everyone could feel, but no one dared to name. Captain Mills sighed. exhaling through his nose. "Mr. Cole, if you refuse to move, I may have to consider further action. You're putting this flight at risk of delay or cancellation." Ethan's inner thoughts swirled. He imagined the headlines, the whispers in boardroom CEO removed from plane. He imagined Jordan Hayes in Houston, waiting, anxious about the deal. He imagined investors second-guessing his ability to avoid conflict. But then he imagined his mother, watching him from beyond, her eyes steady, her voice steadying him. "If you bow here, Ethan, what message do you carry back to your team? What message do you carry to yourself?" His decision crystallized. He lifted his chin slightly, his eyes locking onto the captain's. "If this flight is delayed, it will not be because I failed to comply with my ticketed seat. It will be because this airline chose entitlement over fairness." Gasps came from a few rows back. Someone whispered, "He's right." Another hissed, "Shh, don't get involved." The cabin was alive now, buzzing with silent electricity. Harrington slammed a fist lightly against the armrest. "This is ridiculous. You're going to take his side over mine. I've spent hundreds of thousands on this airline. Who even is he?" His voice was thick with disdain, his eyes blazing with the kind of arrogance only privilege breeds. Ethan heard the words, felt the sting, but refused to flinch. Instead, he answered calmly, "Who I am is irrelevant. What matters is principle." For the first time, Harrington seemed caught off guard. He stared at Ethan, lips parted, as though searching for a retort. None came. Captain Mills straightened, his authority challenged, but not yet broken. "Mr. Cole," he said tightly, "this conversation is over. Stay seated. We'll discuss this further after takeoff." Ethan gave a single nod. "That's all I ask." The captain turned sharply, striding back toward the cockpit. Linda lingered a moment, her eyes flicking nervously between Ethan and Harrington. Then she, too, walked away. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The engines roared louder, the plane taxiing toward the runway. Yet no one was truly at ease. Every passenger knew they had witnessed more than a dispute over a seat. They had seen a battle over dignity itself. Ethan sat still, his gaze fixed once more on the window. His reflection stared back, calm and unbroken. Inside, however, he felt the tremor of conflict, not fear, but the ache of knowing this fight was far from over. Grace's words whispered through his mind again, carrying him forward. Dignity is non-negotiable. An NC-2A. Ethan Cole had chosen to stand. Even while sitting, the engines thundered as the jet surged down the runway, pressing passengers into their seats. First class fell into tense quiet, every creak of the cabin magnified. Ethan Cole stared out the window, watching the ground fall away, the city shrinking into patches of light and shadow. Normally, he loved this moment the lift, the weightlessness, the reminder that perspective widened once you left the earth behind. But today, his stomach stayed heavy, anchored by the storm that had erupted before takeoff. Across the aisle, William Harrington sat rigid, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. His glare cut sideways at Ethan every few minutes, sharp as broken glass. He muttered under his breath, not loudly enough to be clear, but enough to keep the hostility alive. Linda Matthews moved briskly through the cabin once the seatbelt sign turned off, her professional smile returning like a mask she needed to hold in place. She offered drinks, her voice pleasant, but there was an undercurrent of strain. When she reached Ethan, her tone softened in a way that was almost condescending. "Water champagne?" she asked. "Water is fine," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost weary. She nodded and moved on, her shoulders tight. Ethan noticed she did not ask Harrington what he wanted. She already knew. She brought him a glass of red wine without a word, placing it gently on his tray, like a ritual performed countless times. Ethan sipped his water slowly, letting the coolness steady him. The silence in the cabin was deceptive. He could feel the eyes of passengers darting toward him, then away. People whispered behind cupped hands, pretending to look at magazines or phones. He had been in rooms like this before, spaces where judgment floated unseen, unspoken. Inside, his thoughts churned. Jordan Hayes was in Houston, waiting. The investors were likely already gathering, rehearsing their own questions and demands. If news of an incident spread, would they hesitate? Would they think twice about investing in a company led by someone who drew conflict into the spotlight? He rubbed a hand over his face. This was the part that cut deepest, not the confrontation itself, but the weight of what it could cost others. He thought of the employees at Meditech, the teams of engineers, the young interns eager to make a difference. A delay in Houston wasn't just a missed meeting. It was opportunity at risk. And all because a man across the aisle couldn't accept that the world had changed enough for Ethan Cole to sit in 2A. Grace's voice rose again in his mind. "Your dignity is yours. Ethan, if you surrender it, no one else will defend it for you," he whispered back, almost inaudibly. "I know. Mom, I know." The plane leveled at 30,000 feet. The hum of the engine steadied, and the cabin settled into routine. Yet for Ethan, calm was a fragile veneer. Every second felt like the pause before another blow. He thought of the captain's words, "before takeoff, further action." What would that mean at cruising altitude? Would they confront him again, mid-air? Would he be escorted off in Houston, humiliated before strangers and cameras? He closed his eyes, pressing against the darkness. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the ache of anticipation. He imagined Jordan's face, eyebrows furrowed, phone buzzing with messages if news leaked. He imagined headlines spun without context. He imagined the silent satisfaction of people who had doubted him all along. And yet he also imagined Grace's smile, that faint curl at the corners of her lips when she had nothing left but faith. That memory steadied him more than water or altitude ever could. The man in 1C, who had been typing earlier, shifted suddenly. He leaned toward Ethan slightly, voice low enough to avoid attention. "For what it's worth," he murmured. "You're right. Don't let them push you out." Ethan glanced at him, surprised. The man gave a faint shrug, as though to say he had no more courage than that. But even those few words were enough to pierce the silence, a reminder that not everyone in the cabin was blind. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging without drawing attention. Then he sat back, exhaling through his nose. Harrington noticed the exchange and scoffed audibly. "Some people just don't know their place," he muttered, not bothering to hide the words this time. A few passengers stiffened, but no one confronted him. Ethan clenched his jaw, his pulse quickening. He forced himself not to respond, not yet. He let the silence carry his answer instead. Linda returned to clear glasses. She smiled tightly at Ethan again, as though to soothe tension, but he could see the unease in her eyes. She wanted the problem to disappear. She wanted him to disappear. The hours stretched. The cabin lights dimmed for meal service, then brightened again. Ethan barely touched his food. His appetite was gone. consumed by the thoughts circling in his head. He looked out the window instead, watching clouds drift like silent witnesses. He thought of the speech he had planned for Houston, the slides he had rehearsed, the polished tone he had practiced, but all of it felt distant now, like a different life waiting on the other side of turbulence. When the cabin grew quiet again, with passengers dozing or watching movies, Ethan allowed himself a rare crack in composure. He leaned his head back, eyes closed, and let the weight of weariness wash over him. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm, as if holding back the flood of emotion beneath. He wasn't afraid of Harrington. He wasn't afraid of the captain, or even the airline itself. What he feared, what gnawed at him, was the ripple effect. That standing his ground might cost people he cared about. That his decision, however principled, might be seen as reckless by those who depended on him. But then another thought came, quiet yet undeniable. If I yield here, what does that teach them? That compromise is survival, that silence is safer than truth. The struggle burned inside him. One part of him longed for peace, for the easy choice of moving to 3C and arriving in Houston without incident. The other part, the part Grace had raised, the part that carried him from Detroit's cracked sidewalks to boardrooms of glass and steel, knew peace built on surrender was no peace at all. Ethan opened his eyes, gazing again at the reflection in the window. His own face stared back, strong, tired, unbroken, 30,000 feet above the ground, with clouds like ghosts below. He made his choice again, silently but firmly. He would not move, not in this seat, not in this life. The plane cut through the sky, steady at cruising altitude. But inside the first-class cabin, the air still carried unease. Conversations had grown hushed, the clinking of glasses muted, the steady hum of engines overshadowed by the silent weight pressing down on every row. Ethan Cole sat motionless in seat 2A, the same calm posture he had held since takeoff. But his calm was only skin deep. Beneath it, thoughts collided, restless and sharp. The seatbelt across his lap felt heavier than it should have, like a tether holding him between two worlds, one where he yielded for the sake of peace, and one where he stood firm for the sake of principle. The quiet broke when Linda Matthews approached again, walking down the aisle with a stiffness she couldn't mask. She crouched slightly near Ethan, lowering her voice as though confiding in him, though her words carried the weight of authority. "Mr. Cole," she began carefully, "I need to be honest. The captain isn't happy with how this is unfolding. He's concerned that if you don't move seats, it may create a record of noncompliance. That can have serious consequences." Ethan studied her face. She wasn't threatening. Not exactly. She was pleading. But beneath the plea was pressure. The same pressure she had applied earlier, now dressed in official language. "I understand your position," Ethan said quietly, "but I have not broken any rule. I am sitting in the seat that was assigned to me. That is compliance." Linda exhaled, frustrated. "Please, just think about it. There's a perfectly good seat in 3C. You'll still be in first class. You'll still arrive in Houston without incident. Isn't that what you want?" Ethan felt the sting of her words. Without incident, as if his presence in 2A was the problem, not the entitlement that had sparked it. He thought of all the times in his life when people had asked him to avoid making things bigger than they were, when all he had done was exist in spaces others didn't want him in. Before he could answer, Harrington leaned across the aisle, his voice dripping with triumph. "You hear that? Even the captain thinks you're out of line. Stop dragging this out. Move already." Several passengers turned their heads, some frowning, others pretending not to listen. The man in 1C set down his laptop, his eyes flicking from Harrington to Ethan, tension visible in the lines of his jaw. Ethan turned slowly to face Harrington, his expression calm, his voice level. "Mr. Harrington, this is not about you. This is about policy and principle. I will not move." Harrington barked out a bitter laugh. "Policy, principle. You think anyone cares about that? This is about respect. I've earned my place here. You haven't." The words landed like a slap. Ethan felt the old burn of prejudice, not loud, not shouted, but sharpened into implication. "You don't belong. You never did." He steadied his breath, refusing to let anger dictate his response. Respect is not about privilege. Respect is about fairness. A woman 2 rows back spoke up suddenly, her voice trembling but firm. "He's right. He paid for that seat." Why should he move? Heads turned toward her, startled. Her husband tugged at her sleeve, whispering something. But she shook him off. Her eyes stayed locked on Harrington. "This isn't fair." For the first time, silence cracked. Another passenger muttered, "Exactly." Someone else nodded. A ripple moved through the cabin, not loud, but undeniable voices finding courage. Harrington's face flushed, his mouth tightening. "Stay out of this." He snapped at the woman, but the damage was done. The line had been drawn. Passengers were no longer passive. Some still shrank into their seats, unwilling to intervene, but others had chosen a side, and not his. Ethan felt a flicker of strength kindle in his chest. Not triumph, but solidarity. He wasn't alone anymore. Linda's eyes darted nervously around the cabin. This was what she had feared, division spreading among passengers. She straightened and whispered sharply to Ethan, "Please, don't make this worse. If this gets out of hand, the captain may have security waiting when we land." Ethan's stomach tightened at the thought. The image of being escorted off in Houston, cameras flashing, headlines brewing, sent a jolt of dread through him. He thought of Jordan Hayes again, pacing in a conference room, phone buzzing with alerts. He thought of investors' skeptical eyes narrowing, whispers about whether Ethan Cole was too volatile, too risky. His pulse quickened, the weight of responsibility pressing down. Was this stand worth the risk? Was the principle worth the fallout? Grace's voice cut through his doubt. "If you teach the world that your dignity has a price, they will name it for you. Don't let them." He drew a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked at Linda, his eyes unwavering. "If security is waiting, then I will meet them, but I will not move from this seat. Not because I want conflict, not because I seek trouble, but because dignity cannot be bargained away." Linda's lips pressed into a line. She opened her mouth to reply, but hesitated, glancing back toward the galley, torn between her duty and her discomfort. Then, without another word, she walked briskly away. Harrington muttered something harsh under his breath, slamming his wineglass onto the tray table. Red liquid splashed against the rim, staining the white napkin. Ethan turned back toward the window, but he wasn't looking at clouds anymore. He was looking inward, into the storm within himself. The doubts still whispered about Houston, about the risks, about whether this was the hill to fight on. Yet beneath it all was something stronger, something unshakable. The knowledge that if he yielded now, the storm would never truly pass. It would only follow him into every room, every deal, every future confrontation. The cabin returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence. It was charged, fractured, alive with invisible lines drawn. Ethan could feel the shift. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't just be about one man and one seat anymore. It would be about everyone watching, and the choices they made in the face of injustice. At 30,000 feet, among strangers and clouds, a battle over dignity had become something larger, and Ethan knew the landing would decide more than just where the plane touched ground. The plane glided smoothly at 35,000 feet, but inside first class the tension had thickened into something almost physical. The once luxurious cabin now felt like a courtroom in the sky, with unspoken verdicts waiting to fall. Ethan Cole sat steady in 2A, shoulders squared, gaze fixed out the oval window. He had lost track of time, minutes stretched, measured not by clocks, but by the stares, the whispers, the sharp breaths of passengers holding themselves still. The uneasy quiet cracked when the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are cruising smoothly and expect an on-time arrival into Houston. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we encounter a pocket of light turbulence." The announcement was standard, but to Ethan it carried a shadow of something else preparation. Moments later, Linda Matthews returned, her steps sharper than before. Behind her came Captain Robert Mills himself, his broad-shouldered frame filling the aisle. He wasn't smiling this time. His expression was tight, carved by authority and impatience. "Mr. Cole," the captain said, his voice pitched low but clear enough for the cabin to hear. "I'm going to speak plainly. You were asked to move for operational reasons. You've refused. That refusal can be considered non-compliance with crew instructions. If this continues, you may face removal by security upon landing." Gas rippled through the passengers. Some lowered their eyes immediately, unwilling to be drawn in. Others glanced at Ethan, waiting to see how he would respond. Ethan felt his pulse thrum in his temples. He knew what this moment was the escalation, the point at which the conflict became official record. One wrong move, and the narrative could twist beyond his control. CEO removed from flight, he could see the headlines already, splashed across news feeds before his wheels even touched Houston soil. But beneath the swirl of fear was clarity. He had not broken any rule. He had not raised his voice, caused a disturbance, or violated procedure. The only crime was his refusal to surrender a seat that was his by right. He breathed in, slow and deliberate. "Captain," he said, his voice calm, with full respect. "I am not in non-compliance. I am in the seat I purchased, as stated on my boarding pass. Your request, however politely made, is not a lawful order. It is a preference, one that unfairly favors another passenger." Harrington's voice cut through before the captain could respond. "Unbelievable. This man is jeopardizing an entire flight over his ego. I've sat here for years. Everyone knows it. And now the whole cabin has to suffer because he can't be reasonable." A murmur rose from the rows behind. One man muttered, "It's his seat, though," and another whispered agreement. A woman spoke louder this time, her courage sharpened by the tension. "He's not wrong. If it were any of us, we wouldn't be asked to move." The captain's jaw tightened. He turned toward the woman briefly, his eyes narrowing. But she didn't look away. For the first time, authority was not absolute in this cabin. Linda shifted uncomfortably beside him, her professional smile gone. She seemed caught between two fires, her loyalty to the chain of command and the growing discontent of passengers who saw more than she wanted them to. Ethan's heart pounded, but he kept his composure. He could feel Grace's words anchoring him. Dignity is non-negotiable. They had never mattered more than now. in this fragile crucible, 35,000 feet above the earth. "Captain," Ethan continued, his voice carrying across the rows now, "if you remove me for remaining in the seat I lawfully purchased, then you are not enforcing compliance. You are enforcing discrimination. That is not just unjust, it is unlawful." The words landed heavy, undeniable. Passengers shifted, their eyes sharpening, their whispers louder. They were no longer passive spectators. They were witnesses. Harrington slammed a hand against his armrest. "This is ridiculous. You're really going to let him grandstand? I've invested more in this airline than he ever will. That should mean something." A man in 1C turned toward him sharply. "What it means," he said firmly, "is that you think money buys more rights than the rest of us. It doesn't." The cabin stilled. The line had been spoken out loud, plain and unvarnished. Harrington's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, then closed it, fury blazing, but words failing him. Captain Mills inhaled, his chest rising like a man bracing against a storm. He glanced down the aisle, as though calculating how much support he had, how much defiance he could afford. Finally, he said, "Mr. Cole, I am warning you. Upon landing, ground security will be notified. I suggest you prepare yourself." Ethan gave a single nod. His calm was unshaken, though inside, his stomach clenched. This was the outcome he had feared: escalation into official channels, the looming humiliation of being escorted out under watchful eyes and clicking cameras. He imagined Jordan Hayes in Houston, jaw tightening as news spread. He imagined investors whispering, board members questioning. But then he imagined something else: his employees watching this unfold, seeing their leader either shrink back or stand tall. He thought of the young intern he'd met last week, a brilliant black woman who had confided how much it meant to see someone like him at the top. What would he tell her if he gave in now, that survival required silence? His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Captain, if that is your decision, then so be it. But know this, my refusal is not defiance of law. It is defiance of bias, and I will stand by it." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the engine seemed quieter for a moment. Ethan sat back, hands folded in his lap, gaze steady. Grace's presence lingered in him, a whisper of strength. "Don't bow. Ethan, don't teach them. Your worth is negotiable." Passengers looked at him differently now, some still fearful, some uncertain, but others with something like respect. Harrington fumed silently, his entitlement wounded, but not healed. Captain Mills stood for a long moment, then turned abruptly, striding back toward the cockpit. Linda followed quickly, her eyes darting nervously to Ethan before she disappeared behind the curtain. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively, yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was tension coiled tight, waiting for the landing. Everyone knew the story wasn't over. It was only paused, suspended in the thin air between clouds and ground. Ethan leaned back, his face calm, but his chest heavy. He had chosen his ground. He had spoken his truth. Now he could only wait to see what the earth would do with it when the wheels touched down in Houston. The captain's footsteps faded behind the curtain, leaving the first-class cabin steeped in a silence that was anything but calm. The passengers sat frozen, eyes darting toward Ethan, toward Harrington, then toward the empty aisle where authority had just marched away. The engines droned steadily, but inside, it felt like the plane itself was holding its breath. Ethan Cole remained in his seat, posture straight, gaze fixed forward. He had spoken his truth. and though his chest felt tight, his hands betrayed no tremor. Yet inside, his thoughts spun like a storm. He pictured Houston, the bright glass of the terminal, the possibility of uniformed security waiting as the captain had promised. He could see flashes of cameras, hear the cutting tone of reporters' black CEO removed from first-class seat, a story twisted before the truth had time to breathe. He clenched his jaw, forcing the image aside. Fear could not decide this moment. Harrington shifted in 2B, unable to contain himself. He leaned forward, voice dripping with scorn. "You think you've won something by making a scene? You've embarrassed this airline and everyone here with your stubbornness. When security drags you out in Houston, you'll finally understand what respect means." The words slid like acid into the air, and for a moment, no one answered. But then the woman, 2 rows back, the same one who had spoken before, raised her voice again. "No, Mr. Harrington. What he's done is refuse to be bullied. That's not a scene. That's courage." Harrington whipped his head around, glaring at her. "Stay in your lane. Lady, you don't know what you're talking about." Her husband touched her arm, but this time she didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know unfairness when I see it." A ripple of murmurs followed, growing bolder now. One man muttered, "She's right." Another added, "I've flown this airline for years, and I've never seen anyone asked to move like this." The cabin was no longer silent. Voices had emerged, hesitant but undeniable. Ethan felt it like a current, invisible yet pulsing. The truth was spreading, even here at 30,000 feet. Linda Matthews returned with quick steps, her composure fraying. She glanced nervously at the passengers, then crouched by Harrington's seat. "Sir, please," she whispered urgently. "Let's keep this calm until landing." Harrington waved her off, his voice rising. "Calm. This man has hijacked the cabin with his arrogance. And you," he pointed at Ethan, his finger shaking with fury, "you think you're making some noble stand. You're just proving you don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a blade. For Ethan, they were both familiar and piercing. He had heard variations of them all his life, spoken in boardrooms, in quiet corners, in assumptions that followed him like shadows. Yet never had they been spoken so brazenly, so loudly, in a space where strangers bore witness. He inhaled slowly, letting the sting pass through him without lodging in his chest. Then he turned his head, eyes steady on Harrington. "Belonging," Ethan said softly, but clearly enough for the cabin to hear, "is not yours to grant or deny. I belong here because I earned this seat, just as anyone else would." The firmness in his tone cut through the murmurs. Passengers looked between them, tension pulling tighter, but something had shifted. Ethan's words carried weight, not anger, not theatrics, just truth spoken with calm conviction. Linda's face flushed. She rose quickly, retreating toward the galley again, her professionalism unraveling at the seams. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Houston. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." The announcement hit like a countdown clock. Every passenger knew what descent meant, the ground drawing nearer, the moment of reckoning looming. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He pictured the plane rolling to a stop, the doors opening, the sight of security waiting with stern faces, the humiliation of being let off while others watched. And worse, the ripple effect beyond this cabin, into headlines, into boardrooms, into his company's future. His mind flickered to Jordan Hayes, already pacing a conference room in Houston. He imagined Jordan's phone buzzing, messages piling in, panic setting in as news leaked. He thought of the investors waiting with their guarded expressions. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering, "Is this stand worth the fallout? Would it not have been easier to move quietly, to avoid the storm?" But then another voice rose inside him, Grace's voice, firm and unyielding. "If you bend now, Ethan, you teach them that your dignity is negotiable. You teach them that your worth can be traded for convenience." He pressed his palms against his thighs, grounding himself. His mother's words had always been his compass, guiding him from Detroit's cracked sidewalks to this very cabin. They would guide him still. The seatbelt sign chimed. The cabin tilted slightly as the plane descended, engines humming louder, wind brushing against the fuselage. The atmosphere grew heavier, every passenger aware that the landing would bring not just arrival, but confrontation. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. When he opened them, he found the man in 1C watching him. Their gazes locked, and the man gave the faintest nod, a silent message of solidarity. It was enough. Ethan sat taller, his resolve hardening. Harrington, meanwhile, grew more restless. He tugged at his collar, muttering curses under his breath, shifting as though the descent itself irritated him. Finally, he turned again toward Ethan, his voice sharp. "Enjoy your little rebellion while you can. The second we land, it's over." Ethan didn't answer. His silence was louder than words. The plane shuddered gently as it cut through a pocket of turbulence. Gaffs echoed, glasses rattled, but the real tremor ran deeper in the charged air of first class, where battle lines had already been drawn. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers darting like sparks. Some leaned away from Harrington, their disgust thinly veiled. Others looked toward Ethan, their expressions thoughtful, almost reverent. By the time the plane pierced the first layer of clouds, Houston sprawling faintly below, the cabin felt transformed. No longer just a collection of strangers, it had become a stage, and everyone on it a witness. Ethan sat still, bracing for what awaited beyond touchdown. His heart raced, but his spirit did not waver. He had chosen his ground, and now the ground itself was rising to meet him. Whatever happened when the wheels touched down, Ethan knew one thing with clarity: he would not have moved. Not then, not now, not ever. The wheels struck the tarmac with a shudder that rippled through the fuselage. The jolt pressed every passenger back into their seats. But the real weight in the cabin wasn't from gravity. It was from expectation. The long descent had ended, but the confrontation had not. If anything, it was just beginning. Ethan Cole sat still in 2A, eyes forward, breath measured. The engines roared as the plane slowed, tires screeching faintly against concrete. Around him, passengers straightened in their seats, murmurs swelling, whispers trading predictions. Some glanced nervously toward him, others toward Harrington, whose face was flushed and tight with victory he thought was near. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Houston. For your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate." It was the usual script, but this time, every ear heard it differently. The words felt like a countdown. The gate wasn't just an arrival, it was judgment. As the plane taxied slowly, Harrington leaned toward Ethan, his voice low and venomous. "This is it. They'll be waiting. I hope the humiliation is worth it." Ethan didn't turn his head. He had nothing left to say to Harrington. Words weren't the battle now, presence was. The aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign switching off usually meant relief, the signal of freedom, but no one moved. The passengers stayed seated, eyes locked on the front of the cabin, waiting. The door opened with a metallic click. For a moment, all was quiet. Then footsteps echoed up the jet bridge, deliberate and firm. The sound alone silenced the whispers. 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. Their navy jackets bore the insignia of airport police, their expressions impassive, carved by years of confrontation. Behind them stood Catherine Doyle, Skylink's Vice President of Customer Operations, her tailored suit pristine, her smile tight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine announced with practiced calm, "thank you for your patience. We just need to address a small matter before deplaning begins." A chill swept through the cabin. Everyone knew what the small matter was. The officers moved down the aisle with steady steps, stopping in front of 2A. One bent slightly, his voice level. "Mr. Cole, we've been asked to escort you off the aircraft." Every head turned toward Ethan. The cabin was a theater now, and he was at its center. Harrington's lips curved into a smug grin, his satisfaction radiating like heat. Ethan lifted his eyes to the officer. Calm, controlled, inside. His chest tightened, his pulse hammered, but he held his voice steady. "On what grounds?" The officer hesitated, then glanced at Catherine Doyle. She stepped forward smoothly, her tone clipped but courteous. "Mr. Cole, this flight crew made a lawful request which you refused. For operational safety, we cannot ignore non-compliance. We're prepared to offer compensation for the inconvenience, but you will need to leave the aircraft now." Gas fluttered among the passengers. A man in 1C muttered sharply, "That's not right." The woman 2 rows back whispered to her husband, "Loud enough to carry. He didn't do anything wrong." Ethan turned slightly, letting his voice carry. "I have complied with every rule. I have caused no disturbance. The only request I refused was to surrender the seat I purchased, for no reason beyond another passenger's preference. That is not safety. That is bias." The officer's jaw tightened. He shifted uncomfortably, caught between procedure and principle. Catherine's smile faltered. "From behind," Harrington barked out. "Don't listen to him. He's twisting it. Just get him off this plane already." The cabin bristled. A passenger called out, "He's right. This isn't fair," another voice added. "Leave him alone." "Soon," murmurs swelled into a chorus. The quiet dissent that had simmered through the flight had ignited. The officers froze, glancing uneasily at the passengers. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer just one man against authority. It was one man with witnesses. Ethan stood slowly. He wasn't towering, wasn't imposing, but his presence filled the space. His voice was calm but resonant. "If you choose to remove me, do it knowing you are enforcing not safety, but injustice, and let every person here bear witness." The silence that followed was electric. Dozens of eyes locked on the officers, on Catherine, on Harrington. The truth hung between them, undeniable. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Catherine, "this doesn't look good. He's right. He hasn't broken any law." Catherine's composure cracked. For a split second, frustration flickered in her eyes. Then she forced a smile again, her voice sharp but controlled. "This is a private matter of airline policy. Let's not escalate further." But escalation had already come. A man in the back of the cabin raised his phone. Camera recording. Another followed. The glow of screens popped up like fireflies, capturing every second. Harrington's face twisted. Put those away. This isn't your business. The woman who had spoken earlier snapped back. It's everyone's business when injustice happens right in front of us. The officers looked at one another, uncertainty passing between them. One finally straightened, his tone firmer now. Mr. Cole, unless you've broken a law, we can't force you to leave. And I don't see any violation here. Catherine stiffened. Officer, the crew issued a lawful command. The officer shook his head. A request to move seats isn't lawful command unless tied to safety. This doesn't qualify. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin, relief mixed with awe. Ethan stood taller, his heart pounding, but his calm intact. Catherine's jaw tightened. She turned to Linda, who hovered nearby, pale and tense. Did you log this as a safety issue? Linda hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed. She glanced at Ethan, at the passengers watching, at the officers waiting. Finally, her voice came small but clear. No, I logged it as a seating preference conflict. The words fell like stones into silence. Harrington's face drained of color. Catherine's mask of professionalism cracked. Ethan spoke, his voice steady but carrying a quiet force. Then this ends here. I will not be moved, not by preference, not by prejudice. Applause broke suddenly, hesitant at first, then swelling. Passengers clapped, some murmuring words of support. The sound filled the cabin, rolling over Harrington's protests, drowning Catherine's forced composure. The officer stepped back, nodding faintly. Then that's it. One said, Enjoy your stay in Houston, sir. They turned, making their way back up the aisle. Catherine lingered a moment, her smile brittle, her eyes flashing with frustration she couldn't disguise. Then she followed, heels clicking sharply on the floor. Harrington seethed, his voice a low growl. You'll regret this. People like you always do. Ethan looked at him, unshaken. The only regret, he said softly, is when people trade their dignity for silence. The cabin quieted again, but the energy was different now. Ethan sat back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Relief washed through him. Not victory, just the deep release of standing his ground and still standing. He thought of Grace. You held your dignity. Ethan, you held it where it mattered most. The doors opened again, the call to deplane ringing out. Passengers began to rise, but more than a few stopped by Ethan's seat as they passed. Some offered quiet words. Good for you. Stay strong. You were right. Others simply gave a nod, silent gestures of respect. Ethan accepted them all. Calm, steady. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't boastful. He was simply unbroken. Houston awaited, with its own challenges, its own consequences. But for now, on this plane, Ethan had carried not just his own dignity, but the truth that some things could not be bought, traded, or forced away. And for the first time in hours, as he rose to leave, Ethan felt the cabin breathe freely again. The jet bridge was always a narrow, forgettable corridor, but tonight it felt like the longest walk Ethan Cole had ever taken. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as passengers filed out behind him. Voices hushed but electric. Every step carried the weight of what had just happened in the cabin. Ethan moved calmly, shoulders square, but inside, his chest thrummed with adrenaline. He wasn't naive. He knew what waited beyond the gate. The airline hadn't backed down because it had wanted to. It had backed down because it had to, and that meant the moment he stepped into the terminal, the battle would only shift terrain. The gate doors slid open, and suddenly, the hum of the terminal rushed in voices, footsteps, the distant echo of rolling suitcases. But layered over it was something sharper. The metallic clicks of cameras, the buzz of cell phones raised high. A small crowd had gathered, tipped off by passengers who'd been live-streaming from the cabin. Airport staff stood stiff near the podium, their smiles forced. A few journalists, quick-footed and hungry, were already there, microphones in hand. "Mr. Cole," one reporter called out as Ethan stepped forward. "Can you confirm you were nearly removed from first class for refusing to give up your seat?" Another voice chimed in. "Do you believe this was racially motivated?" Ethan paused, the cameras flashing in his face. He felt every eye on him, passengers, staff, strangers curious about the commotion. He could feel Harrington's presence just behind him, radiating indignation, waiting to pounce with his own narrative. Ethan's instinct told him to keep moving, to slip past quietly, to wait until he was with Jordan Hayes and the legal team before speaking. But then he caught sight of a young woman at the edge of the crowd, her phone clutched tightly, her eyes wide. She couldn't have been older than 20, and the look on her face was one he recognized instantly, hope mixed with fear. He thought of Grace, of the lessons she had drilled into him, of the young intern he'd promised never to disappoint. This moment wasn't about his comfort. It was about something larger. He stopped. The terminal hushed. Then, in a voice calm and clear, Ethan spoke. "I was asked to surrender my seat." He said, "A seat I purchased, a seat I had every right to occupy." The request was not about safety. It was not about procedure. It was about preference. And preference, when it disadvantages someone for who they are, is not just unfair, it's discrimination. The words carried, steady and measured. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Harrington pushed forward, his face red. "Don't listen to him. He's twisting the facts. The crew made a lawful order, and he disobeyed. He put everyone at risk with his arrogance." Gasps and whispers surged. Ethan didn't flinch. He looked directly at Harrington, his voice level. "Risk is when safety is ignored. I complied with every safety instruction. The only thing I refused was to make myself smaller for your comfort. That isn't arrogance. That's dignity." The crowd erupted, some clapping, others murmuring approval. A man near the gate podium said loudly, "Good for you," someone else shouted. "About time somebody stood up to this nonsense." Harrington sputtered, but the tide had shifted. Cameras turned toward Ethan, away from him. Catherine Doyle appeared at the edge of the scene, her composure cracking under the flash of media lights. She forced a smile, stepping forward with corporate polish. "Skylink values all our passengers," she said smoothly. "We regret any misunderstanding and will conduct a full review of the incident." The reporters pounced. "Miss Doyle, is it true, Mr. Cole was threatened with removal despite breaking no laws. Was this a case of racial bias? Catherine's practiced veneer wavered. "We take such concerns seriously and will be reviewing crew actions immediately." It was a non-answer, but the cameras had already decided where their focus belonged. Ethan stood centered, calm, resolute, while Skylink's executive floundered. As the questions flew, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He slipped it out discreetly. Jordan Hayes' name flashed across the screen. He didn't answer, but the text that followed made his pulse race. "We need you in conference immediately. Story breaking everywhere. Investors watching." Ethan tucked the phone away, his expression unreadable. He knew the battle had just expanded. This wasn't just about a cabin in the sky anymore. This was about boardrooms, contracts, reputations, entire futures. Passengers from first class began stepping into the terminal, some pausing beside him. The woman who had defended him on the plane approached, her eyes fierce. "You didn't just stand for yourself back there," she said. "You stood for all of us. Don't forget that." Ethan met her gaze, nodded once, "Thank you," as she left. Others echoed small words of support. "Stay strong. We saw what happened. Don't let them spin it." Each voice steadied him, even as the storm swirled louder. Harrington, meanwhile, stormed off toward the VIP lounge, his muttered curses trailing behind him. Catherine followed quickly, phone already pressed to her ear, voice tight with urgency. The crowd slowly thinned, but the buzz lingered. Ethan finally moved forward, bodyguards appearing discreetly at his side, sent by Jordan, no doubt. He didn't resist their presence. Tonight wasn't about bravado. It was about survival with integrity intact. As he walked toward the exit, his thoughts swirled. What would tomorrow hold? A canceled contract? A stock dip? A media frenzy that painted him either as a hero or a troublemaker? The doubt gnawed again. Was it worth it? Should I have just moved? But then he thought of Grace, of the countless times she had reminded him. The world will test you in places where no one's watching. But the truest test is what you do when everyone is. Tonight, everyone had been watching, and he hadn't bent. By the time Ethan reached the waiting car outside, Houston's night air pressed hot against his skin. He climbed in, shutting the door softly. His phone buzzed again, Jordan's call this time. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then finally answered. "Jordan," he said quietly, "you're all over the news." Jordan's voice came, tight with urgency. "Half the country's calling you a hero. The other half, well, you can imagine. Skylink's already in damage control. Harrington's name is trending for all the wrong reasons. And our deal, let's just say tomorrow's board meeting is going to be complicated." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. "Then tomorrow, we tell the truth. No more silence. No more trading dignity for comfort." Jordan was quiet for a beat. Then his voice softened. "You sure you're ready for the firestorm?" Ethan opened his eyes, gaze steady on the lights of Houston flashing by. "I didn't choose the storm, but I won't run from it." The car sped into the night, the city alive around him. The storm had broken, but Ethan knew it was only the beginning. And somewhere, deep inside, he felt his mother's voice again, calm, unwavering. "You stood tall, Ethan. And now, let them see you for who you are." The boardroom on the 48th floor of the Chase Tower in downtown Houston was made of glass and steel, designed to intimidate. The panoramic view of the city glimmered under the morning sun. But inside the room, the air was dense with tension. Executives from Coal Dynamics sat on one side of the table, investors from Skylink Airlines on the other. The contract folders stacked neatly between them felt less like business and more like weapons waiting to be drawn. Ethan Cole entered quietly, Jordan Hayes at his side. His suit was pressed, his expression calm, but the storm of the previous night clung to him like a second skin. Phones had buzzed endlessly, screens had flooded with headlines, and across the country, debates had already ignited. Some called him a troublemaker who had embarrassed an airline. Others called him a hero who had drawn a line in the sand. As he took his seat, the whispers around the table stilled. Every gaze turned toward him. At the far end, Skylink CEO, Richard Lang, cleared his throat. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice brittle with forced civility. "Before we proceed with business, I believe last night incident requires discussion. Ethan folded his hands on the table. It does. Lang shifted uncomfortably. I assure you, Skylink takes this matter very seriously. We regret any misunderstanding on our aircraft. Jordan leaned forward, his tone sharp. A misunderstanding. Your airline nearly dragged a paying passenger from his seat. Not just any passenger, a partner negotiating a $500 million deal. Lang bristled. Our crew made a decision in the moment. No, Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. Your crew made a choice to protect the comfort of a powerful man over the dignity of another. That wasn't a mistake. That was a reflection of culture. The room went still. Some executives shifted uneasily, their pens tapping nervously against the table. Lang forced a smile, brittle and hollow. Mr. Cole, surely you understand the pressures of public perception. This story has already been exaggerated in the media. We'd prefer to resolve it quietly, without damaging either of our reputations. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Reputations aren't damaged by truth. They're damaged by how we respond to it. Jordan slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of headlines from overnight Skylink faces backlash. Over first-class discrimination. CEO Ethan Cole confronts bias at 30,000 feet. Viral video sparks debate on airlines and equality. The investors leafed through them, their expressions darkening. Numbers followed stock dips, consumer polls, canceled reservations. Lang's voice tightened. You must realize, this could hurt your company too. Do you really want to anchor coal dynamics to this kind of spectacle? Ethan's lips curved faintly. Not a smile, but the suggestion of one. I didn't create the spectacle. I sat in a seat I paid for. Your airline created the rest. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Finally, one of the Skylink investors spoke, her voice sharp with frustration. Richard, this is untenable. The public is furious. The optics are catastrophic. Frankly, the only way forward is accountability, and that starts with cleaning house. Lang stiffened. Excuse me? But the murmurs of agreement around the table were undeniable. Executives exchanged looks, nodding grimly. Jordan leaned back, his expression cool. The tide was shifting, faster than even he had expected. Ethan's phone buzzed silently in his pocket. He ignored it, keeping his eyes on Lang. For a moment, he thought of Grace again. When people show you who they are, believe them, Lang sputtered, trying to regain control. You can't possibly think one misunderstanding warrants the investor cut him off. This isn't about one misunderstanding. This is about systemic arrogance, about the way people like Harrington were protected while others were humiliated. And it's on your watch. The words landed like hammer blows. Lang's face drained of color. Ethan finally spoke, his tone measured. I came here ready to finalize a partnership. But after last night, I see clearly what this partnership would mean. My company does not trade dignity for dollars. Not mine. Not anyone's. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor. Every head turned toward him, some with surprise, some with quiet respect. I am walking away from this deal, Ethan said simply, not out of anger, not out of pride, but because some lines cannot be crossed. And if we keep crossing them, if we keep excusing them, then nothing changes. The silence was absolute. Lang opened his mouth, but no words came. Jordan rose beside him, gathering the folders. The message was clear. The decision was final. As Ethan turned to leave, One of the investors called after him, "Mr. Cole." He paused, glancing back. The woman who had spoken earlier looked at him with steady eyes. "Thank you. Sometimes it takes someone willing to walk away to remind us what matters." Ethan gave a small nod, then left the boardroom. The hallway outside felt strangely quiet after the storm inside. Jordan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You just walked away from $500 million. Ethan adjusted his cuff, his voice even. "I walked away from $500 million chains." Jordan studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Grace would be proud. Ethan's throat tightened, but he only nodded. By the time they reached the lobby, reporters were waiting, cameras flashing. Ethan stepped into the sunlight, Houston buzzing around him, the noise of the city folding into the noise of the world. He didn't shrink from it. He let it come. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Cole, do you regret your decision to walk away from the Skylink deal?" Ethan stopped, turned slightly toward the cameras. His voice carried, clear and steady. "Regret comes from silence," he said. "Regret comes from watching injustice and doing nothing. I will never regret standing for dignity mine or anyone else's." The crowd erupted, microphones surging forward. But Ethan kept walking. The words had been said. The story would now belong to others. As the car pulled away, he sat back, closing his eyes briefly. Grace's voice was there again, soft but certain. "You did not bend, Ethan. And because of that, others will stand taller." The city stretched ahead, the future uncertain but unshaken. For Ethan Cole, the storm had not broken him. It had defined him. At the end of the day, Ethan Cole didn't walk away with a deal worth $500 million. He walked away with something far greater, his dignity intact, and a message that echoed across boardrooms, airports, and living rooms everywhere. He proved that respect cannot be bought, that silence only protects the powerful, and that standing tall in the face of injustice can change more than just one life. But the question lingers, how many times has a story like this played out unseen, unheard, ignored? How many people have been asked to make themselves smaller so that others could feel bigger? This story is more than headlines, more than contracts. It's a reminder that the fight against discrimination doesn't happen in courtrooms or parliaments alone. It happens in the everyday spaces we all share. A plane, a classroom, an office. Ethan's stand is a call to all of us to see, to speak, and to act. Because dignity isn't negotiable. If this story touched you, share it. If it made you think, talk about it. And if you believe in the power of standing up, then like, share, and subscribe, because more stories that matter are on the way.